Hi everyone, my name is Monica Taylor, and I'm excited to be participating in a month-long event called INKtoberfest, sponsored by Makers Forte. Every day in October, you're going to have a designer provide you with a tutorial on a specific technique or product. For day 8, I'm going to be sharing with you some ways to use Ultra Thick Embossing Powder to create some fabulous backgrounds. When heated up, embossing powder creates a resist, and it enables you to use your ink to be able to cover parts of your card without affecting the part that you've embossed. So I want to show you 3 cards today and 3 techniques on how to use some of this embossing powder to create some great results. Now for my cards today, I'm going to be using some glossy paper, and the reason I chose glossy paper is because I'm going to be swiping some of my ink on this paper, and glossy paper works really well for these techniques. Now the ink that I'm going to be using today is from Makers Forte, and it's called Fog. I'm also going to be using some clear embossing ink for my techniques. Now when I first opened up this ink, I was really impressed at how juicy the ink pads were. So I knew this would be perfect for the technique I wanted to share with you today, because I'm going to be swiping it onto my glossy cardstock. Ink swiping is a great way to match your cardstock to your sentiment, and you get an even better result when you use embossing powder to create a resist. So for my first card, I wanted to go ahead and just create some simple lines. So I'm using my blue painter's tape along with my media mat to add the painter's tape to my cardstock. And your stripes can be as thick or as thin as you want. I knew I was going to be stamping a sentiment on the ink portion of my stripes, so I wanted to make sure it was thick enough to be able to hold my sentiment. I lined up my tape at the bottom of the card, and then again using my media mat, I moved the tape up about 3 or 4 lines, and I added another piece of tape. And I did this all the way till I got to the end of my card, basically the top of my card. And then I'm taking my clear embossing ink and I'm basically just swiping it over the white portion of the card. Now remember, this is glossy paper stock, so it is sliding very nicely. It's very smooth, and I'm getting lots of ink on my cardstock. Typically when I'm creating a card, I'll start out with a piece of cardstock a little bit bigger than my finished design. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, I always like to have an organic look on my finished card. And having an organic look, especially if I'm going to be doing some stamping, helps when I trim it down. Another reason is if I am going to use a die, I want to make sure I have some options as to where I'm going to actually use my die on my cardstock. If your design is random, you can always choose what part of your card you want to have trimmed off. For this particular card, I'm just going with stripes, so it's not going to be a lot of options as far as placing my die when I'm finished here, but I will be able to at least cut off that flaw when pulling up my tape. Now this ink is really juicy, so I had a couple of seconds here to go ahead and get that tape up and then add my embossing powder. I'm using clear embossing powder here, and as you can see, I'm being very generous, and this is because I'm creating some solid stripes. If I was just using a stamped sentiment or something that had thinner stripes, I probably wouldn't need to pour on so much of my embossing powder. But knowing that I have that white paper underneath my card, I can easily scoop up the excess and pour it right back into my jar. And that way I don't have any waste. Now the nice thing about heat embossing is you're going to be able to see the plastic melting right in front of your eyes. But you want to make sure that your heating tool is really hot. So I would recommend you turn it on and just have it run for a couple of seconds before you actually take it to your paper. That way you're not having to wait too long holding it over your paper. Now for the glossy cardstock, it really wasn't a problem. But if you're using thinner paper or even vellum paper, this might actually burn your paper. So you don't want any of those brown marks from your heating tool being too hot. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're embossing. Turn on your heating tool for just a couple of seconds and then start to run it over your paper. I also love to add embossing powder over my stamped sentiments. And this is for a couple of reasons. Number one, it really does create a nice resist, especially if, again, I'm going to be swiping ink over it. But it also makes your sentiment pop. It gives it that shiny plastic look because essentially that is what embossing powder is. It's tiny particles of plastic. When heated up, create a nice shiny resist. All right, so the stamp set that I'm using today from Makers Forte is called Bold Holiday Sentiments, and it has some really fun Christmas sentiments. And I'm using the Happy Holidays stamp, which is one long stamp, but I wanted my Happy and my Holidays words to be separated. So I'm using just a really easy technique here using my stamping platform, and I'm only inking up half of the word. So for the first part of the word, I inked up Happy, and I went ahead and I stamped it on the non-embossed portion of my card. And then I'm going to move over my paper stock just a little bit, and then I'm going to place my stamp again, but this time I'm going to only ink up the word holidays, so that way I have two separate words rather than one long word. And then once I have both words stamped, again, I'm going to add my embossing powder over my cardstock, specifically over the words, and then I'm going to heat emboss it once again. Now, embossing powders come in all colors, but the color that I'm using today is clear, and this is enabling me to use some of my stamps. And today, like I said, I'm using Fog for my background, and I'm using a black ink for my sentiment. And then I'm going to go ahead and add my clear embossing powder directly over my sentiment and heat emboss it once again. And the sentiment really took me no time at all to heat it up because it is a lot thinner and not as thick as the stripes that I heat embossed earlier. So I'm just adding a little bit of my embossing powder over my sentiment, and then I'm going to pour it right back into my jar, and then I'll heat emboss it. And now I have a nice resist, not only for my background stamps, but also for my sentiment. So the stamp sentiment didn't take much time at all to heat emboss it. So I just, again, using my heating tool, and I let it warm up for just a couple of seconds. I ran it over my Happy Holidays, and then I was ready to add my ink. So the ink that I'm working with today is called Fog. And this is kind of a light gray. It really is a great background because it's not too dark, and it works great on this resist. Now, of course, any ink is going to be able to work for this, but I really wanted to show you how nice this ink is because the stamp sentiment just really shows up nicely on this, and it creates a really subtle background. So once I swiped my ink, I took a scrap towel and I just went ahead and I wiped it over my cardstock. And as you can see, all the ink that was over the embossed portion of my card just basically wiped right off. And now I have a nice background with a nice pop of a sentiment. So once the stamping and the inking was complete, it was time to go ahead and mount my cardstock onto some black cardstock. I really like the look of black cardstock because it really makes the card pop. But I also wanted to add a couple of embellishments just to give the card a little bit more interest. So I decided to pull out some sheer ribbon because, again, I'm going for a really subtle look. And sheer ribbon ties nicely into bows as well. So before I actually mount my stamped card base, I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of glue to the base of the card and add the ribbon. And this way I know that it'll stay in place. And then I'm going to go ahead and add my wet adhesive to the back of my cardstock and put it right over that ribbon onto the black cardstock. And then once that glue dries just a bit, because I don't want it actually lifting up, I'm going to go ahead and tie a nice simple knot to create a faux bow, and then I'll add a couple of gems just to finish off the card. And then I'm ready to mount it onto my white cardstock. So in just a few steps, I was able to create a very simple holiday card, which will be easy to replicate if you have several cards that you have to make over the holiday. You can easily use the same design and just change up the ink a little bit to create similar but different cards. And then for the bow at the end, you don't even have to tie a real bow. All you have to do is just tie a knot and trim off the edges, and you have a nice embellishment. All right, so let's go ahead and get into card number 2. Okay, so for the second card, we're going to be creating a 5x7 card. And we're going to be using a stencil instead of using some removable tape. Stencils are great for the embossed resist technique. You're able to create wonderful backgrounds using different stencils, which will give you different backgrounds. Okay, so the stencil that I'm going to be using for my second card is called Centering In on Things. And I love this stencil. This stencil is oversized, so it will easily fit my cardstock. I can make a small A2 card, but then I can also make a 5x7 card, and I have no problem creating a nice covered background using this stencil. So because the stencil is oversized and it completely covers my cardstock, I'm going to go ahead and tape down my paper, and then I'm also going to tape down one side of my stencil. And this enables me to be able to fold it open like a book, to be able to check my ink if I need to without having it move. And this way I can ink, or I can use clear embossing ink easily without having to realign my stencil. All right, so once my stencil is in place, again, I'm just taking my clear embossing ink and I'm swiping over the stencil. Now, depending on how intricate your stencil is, you may have to swipe it a few times just to make sure you get some of that wet embossing ink into the design of your stencil. And if you want to check it along the way, this is where it comes in handy to have it taped down on one side so you can easily lift up the stencil and look underneath to make sure you have enough clear embossing ink. All right, so once I was happy with my coverage, I went ahead and I pulled out my embossing powder, and again, I am generously adding my embossing powder over my background. Remember, you want to make sure you get enough ink all over your background to cover every part of the background that you've embossed. If you have really intricate stencils, it may be really hard to see some of that ink, especially the clear embossing ink, because if you don't have a shiny card like I do, it may be hard to see where the wet portion is on your card. So make sure that you are generous and you have nice coverage all over your card. And then once again, you're going to get out your heating tool and you want to turn it on for just a couple of seconds to make sure it's nice and hot. And then you want to run the heat over all of the embossing powder. Now again, you're going to be able to see this embossing powder melt right in front of your eyes. So just take your time and make sure that you heat set all of your background, because it's very easy to miss some of the powder. And if you do miss some of the powder, then you won't have the resist that you're going to want. And then once it's completely heat set, then it's time to get out your ink pad and swipe your cardstock. Now remember, we're using glossy cardstock, so this ink is going to slide really nicely onto your background. And be generous, because you're going to be able to wipe off the excess ink so that way your embossed portion of your background is going to really pop and shine. And then once again, when you're happy with the coverage, all you have to do is take a paper towel or a craft rag that you might have on your desk and wipe over your cardstock. And you want to put a little bit of elbow grease into this, because you want to make sure that you get the ink off of the embossed portion. It's not going to stick at all, and you're not going to hurt your cardstock at all, but it's going to be really a nice shine. It's kind of like waxing your car. You just want to make sure that you get all of the pieces of ink off of the embossed area, so that way the embossing powder will show through. And then once I was happy with the background, again, I just took the oversized cardstock and I trimmed it down, and I'm going to mat it onto some black cardstock. Now, like I indicated earlier, this is going to be a 5x7 card, and this piece here that I'm mounting onto the black cardstock is the center portion of the card. So I'm also going to take a 5x7 piece of cardstock, and I'm going to trim it down 1/4 inch, and then I'm going to use the same color of ink to swipe the edge of this piece of cardstock. I don't necessarily have to cover the entire piece, because the center portion of my design is going to cover most of the background. So all I need to do is just make sure I have enough ink on the outer edges of the cardstock, so that way it matches. And now that I have matching cardstock, I can easily mount the smaller piece of my design onto this bigger portion of my cardstock, and I will have two pieces that match nicely. Now to adhere my cardstock, I am using liquid glue, and I really love using liquid glue because I have that movement time. And I don't know about you, but a lot of times when I am layering cardstock, I can't get it just right. So having that extra second to be able to adjust my layers and make sure they're straight is just really nice. And that's why I love working with liquid glue. All right, so now we're going to move on to the sentiment. And again, I just took some of that extra cardstock that I had swiped the fog ink onto, and then I took one of the sentiments and I stamped it right in the middle. And then once again, I'm going to go ahead and add some embossing powder over my sentiments, and then heat emboss it so that way it gives it that shine like the rest of the card. And then after I've heat embossed it, I'm going to also go ahead and mount it onto the black cardstock so that way the entire card is cohesive. And then instead of gluing the sentiment directly onto the cardstock, I decided to use some foam tape to go ahead and have that sentiment lift up just a little bit, and that will create some dimension and give the card a little bit more interest. Now at this point your card can definitely be complete, but I decided again to add a couple of more embellishments, and since I had that sheer ribbon right on my desktop, I decided to go ahead and add a real bow this time, and then add a couple of gems just to give it a little bit of sparkle. Okay, so let's start talking about our third card. For the first two cards, we used some sort of a stencil or some sort of tape to cover background. This time we're going to actually stamp with a sentiment stamp, and I'm going to show you how you can easily create a background using a sentiment stamp, your stamping platform, and some embossing ink. Now you can definitely do this technique without having some sort of a stamping platform, but your sentiment may not be exactly lined up. I find using the stamping platform and the grid on my platform makes it really easy to make sure my sentiments are exactly the same distance apart and lined up exactly the same left to right side. Now again, I'm going to be creating an A2 size card, but this time I'm going to be creating a horizontal card that folds up, and I'm going to use a longer stamp set. So the stamp that I used on the Happy Holidays was also a long stamp, but I only inked part of the part of the stamp. I inked the Happy, and then I inked the Holidays. But for this particular card, I'm going to be using Merry Christmas, and I'm going to stamp the entire stamp across my cardstock. So the first thing I wanted to do is make sure that I have my cardstock lined up on the grid and make sure it's straight. And then I'm going to take my stamp and I'm going to add some embossing ink to it, and then I'm going to move it up 2 lines. I want to make sure I have just enough space in between each sentiment, but I want to make them tight. So 2 lines was perfect amount of distance. And then I'm going to continue to do this. I'm going to go ahead and add more ink to my stamp, and then I'm going to continue to move my cardstock up 2 lines. And using the grid ensures that I will have a nice straight word, but it will also make sure that I have the exact same distance between each sentiment stamped. Now remember, we're creating resists today. So once I have all of my sentiments stamped all the way down, I'm going to go ahead and add my embossing powder, and then I'm going to heat emboss it, and then I'm going to add my ink. But this technique can be used not only with embossing inks and embossing powders, but inks as well. So this is a great way to create a background without having to spend lots of money on designer paper. And since you're going to be stamping your sentiments several times, you want to make sure that you do have enough ink on your stamp so that way when you do go to emboss it, your ink isn't dry. You shouldn't have a problem because these cards aren't very big, but remember, you're not just stamping and then taking your embossing powder directly to your ink. You're actually stamping your cardstock several times, and it could give your ink a chance to dry. So you just want to make sure that you have a nice amount of ink on each stamped image so that way it doesn't dry you too quickly. And then once you've finished stamping all of your sentiments, again, you want to get your white piece of paper underneath your cardstock and you want to generously add your embossing powder. You don't want to skimp on this because your sentiments are very thin and you want to make sure you have really nice coverage. It's easy on this technique to miss some of your ink. So just cover your entire cardstock and move it around a little bit just to make sure you get full coverage. And then once again, you're going to bring out your heating tool and turn it on and leave it on for just a couple of seconds to make sure it's nice and hot. And then you're going to thoroughly run the heat element over your cardstock to make sure you emboss every part of your powder. You really don't want to miss any part of this sentiment being heat set because this is your full background. And you're not going to have a lot of room to trim either because your sentiment pretty much will cover most of your card. You'll have a little bit of area to trim once you're finished, but for the most part, it will be most of the sentiment showing on your background. So you want to make sure that every piece of letter gets heat embossed. And then once you're happy with the coverage, again, just take your ink pad and swipe over your paper. And then once you have enough ink coverage, take your paper towel or your craft rag and then just wipe it off to get that ink off of the embossed portion of your sentiment. And then once you're happy with the coverage, then you can cut off 1/4 inch to add some black cardstock to mount your card. Now, when you are trimming your cardstock, you may want to just cut a little bit off of each side. You don't necessarily want to cut the full 1/4 inch off of one side because then your sentiments won't be aligned in the center. So just trim it slowly, rotating your card till you get the amount of trimming you want to be able to mount your black cardstock. Now this background is definitely a little bit more subtle. You can see that you can definitely see the sentiment when you tilt your card. So if you want to, you might want to add a few more gems or just even maybe some Nouveau drops or some sort of a color addition to the card just to give it a little bit more pop. And that'll do it. I hope that you've enjoyed the process today of heat embossing your backgrounds to create a resist. Embossing powder can be a lot of fun, not only for sentiments, but also for creating your backgrounds. All right, everybody. Thanks so much for stopping by, and we will see you again next time.